Greetings. My name is Peter Krause. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston College and a research affiliate in the MIT Security Studies program. I know many of you have attended some of my prior talks, so welcome back if so. If you're new here, then I'm excited to be engaging with you today on words matter, how we define, use, and react to sensitive words, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This talk is one in a series, as I've mentioned. So there's been a mini series of 3 talks this fall. This is the second of the 3. So if you missed the first session on the 2024 US election and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how the outcome here impacts the situation there, there is another recording of that session. So if you contact Meta MIT, you can access that. This is the recording for session 2 on words matter. Again, understanding how Palestinians and Israelis define, use, and react to different charged words. There will be a third live session on November 13th from 12 to 2 p.m. on the struggle over normalization and the future of American-Israeli relations in the region, American-Arab-Israeli relations in the region. There will also be a recording of that session just in case you cannot attend live. But if you do attend live, there will be, back and forth Q&A and discussion, which is great. So attend if you can. If you can't, the recordings will be available. And I'll also say, as I referred to, there was a series of talks that I did last year at MIT that was more on historical issues. So the history of Zionism, Palestinian nationalism, peace processes, conflicts, October 7th, situation in Gaza, Lebanon, etc. So if you're interested in those issues, there's also recordings available via Meta MIT for those. Just as a reminder, and perhaps a new thing for those of you who have not attended these sessions before, the purpose of these sessions is really for the MIT community. I'm trying here to increase knowledge, increase understanding, increase empathy. The goal is not to either push upon you nor force everyone to be unanimous in our opinions on history and politics. That's impossible. It's not going to happen. But what I am trying to do is help to provide a shared foundation of knowledge, because I know many of us care very deeply about Israelis, about Palestinians, but at the same time, the types of information we have available to us, whether on social media or otherwise, of mixed quality. And so what I'm trying to do with these sessions is to go deeper, maybe to talk about topics in ways you haven't seen before, and give you jumping off points for your own discussions, whether it's with colleagues or with students or with faculty or with friends and family. So I hope that that's what these sessions will help you achieve in your daily lives. So let's start today. And I'll start with, a bunch of, intense imagery in some sense, from protest, both pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian protest, memes and things you may have seen online, headlines of articles on Israeli newspapers, Middle Eastern, Palestinian newspapers, lots of things, right? We probably all have seen these slogans or some of this stuff talked about, but just to give us a little entree into today, we see protests here for a pro-Palestinian protest. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We see a meme that some pro-Israeli commenters have put in, from the river to the sea. That's the flag you're going to see. A march for Israel, and you can see one of the signs being held in the background, condemn Hamas terrorism. Then we see globalize the Intifada, which is a protest done at kind of a pro-Palestinian march. We see headlines from newspapers. First, from the Israeli newspaper, talking about Iranian footage showing injured Hezbollah terrorist after the pager explosion. So again, like applying this label of terrorism. And then you also see Al Jazeera saying, quote, pure terrorism, the world reacting to Israeli settler attack in the West Bank. So, these words here, terrorism, from the river to the sea, Intifada, like these are very charged words. What I mean by charged words is that many people, perhaps including yourself, have strong emotional reactions to one or more of them. But at the same time, they're unavoidable in the sense that people, when they talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the current context that we're seeing, like whether it's in newspapers or in protest marches or in conversations you're having or on social media exchanges, like you see these words, you see people use them. It often can be the source of consternation or debate or even, fights between individuals. And so what I'm trying to do today is give you an understanding not only of kind of the quote unquote academic definition of these terms, but also how different communities kind of define, use, and react to them. Because I think that's very important. Even if you feel strongly that I know what this word means, I have the exact definition for it, I'm going to show you in polls that there's a number of people who are not going to probably agree with your definition. And they're going to, even if they maybe agree with some of the definition, they may disagree with how you or others apply it. And maybe you're applying it not fully consistently to kind of both sides, quote unquote. Or even if you are, or even if you and your partner in conversation agree on the term, maybe how you react to hearing that term is different. And so ultimately, if your goal is to have constructive conversation or at least have people try to understand what you're saying, you need to have a better understanding of how people are going to react to and receive the words that you're using, and vice versa. Hopefully, by understanding a little bit more about how you react to and interpret different words, you can improve your knowledge and your ability to converse, effectively with people around you, even if, again, your goal is not just let's have a perfect mutual understanding. Your goal is, I want to win this debate or I want to win this policy argument. Trust me, being able to understand how different populations define, interpret, and use different terms is really effective and important because ultimately, if you're in the debating business or the policy changing business, you're also in the changing people's minds and convincing them that you're right business. And so understanding ultimately the meaning of these terms and how different populations interpret them is essential, regardless of what your objective is here today. So let's start a little bit with why I think this matters. And, maybe I don't have to convince a lot of you who are coming to this talk, but there was a poll done in January of this year by the College Pulse surveying students around campuses in the United States. And this question was asked: in the past 2 months, have you felt you were in personal danger because of your support for either Israelis or Palestinians in the current war between Israel and Hamas? And you can see just overall, about a fifth of all students felt they were in danger, which to me is, a very worrying statistic in and of itself, to have a fifth of our students feel like they're in danger because they supported or have sympathy for, solidarity for, Palestinians or Israelis. I think that's incredibly problematic. I think that, we should be in a country where people can support different populations who are in crisis and not have to feel personally in danger because of doing so. So that in and of itself is worrying. But it's especially worrying when we look at certain populations, right? When we look at the Jewish students and Muslim students, over half of them feel like they have felt in danger as a result of their support for either of these populations. And that's incredibly worrying, right? And look, certainly sometimes people can feel like, I feel unsafe, when in reality it's, I'm a bit uncomfortable talking about this and it's making me emotional. But at the same time, we know, and we've seen stories of this, like there have been individuals who have been doxxed, who have been, faced threats, whether online or real ones from people around them because of their political views. And so, I think that's incredibly problematic, but it also shows again how words and opinions, matter. And so understanding this stuff, I think, is really important, and hopefully in some small way can contribute to a lessening of these numbers, at least in our own communities, where hopefully people are putting the time in to understand, different perspectives and how people define, interpret, and utilize these terms. Now, let's go right into it. Again, with these talks, as I tell you, I never shy away from, what's the most pressing stuff, even if they're difficult or sensitive. And that's in many ways what today's talk is about. We're going to talk right about these slogans and, terms like terrorism and occupation and things of that nature. So let's start with this one, again, with a very interesting poll to start us out. So people were asked, again, college students in January of this year, when you hear the statement, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," what do you think it means? So you just take a minute for a moment and look at all of these different responses. So there's 4 different potential choices here. And then also broken down by, again, all students, Jewish students, and Muslim students. So just check that out for a moment. So right off the bat, I mean, to me, there's so many fascinating observations here. First and foremost, if we go to the right 2 columns, the significant disconnect between Jewish and Muslim students. So for Jewish students, 66%, very strong majority, 2/3 say when they hear that statement, whether it's at a protest or someone saying it or they read it online, they interpret it as Palestinians should replace Israelis in the territory, territory meaning, Israel, West Bank, Gaza, even if it means the expulsion or genocide of Israeli Jews. So, quite an extreme thing, right? It's like when they hear that phrase, it means that Israelis are going to be pushed out of the territory, whether they're going to be killed, whether they're going to be forcibly expelled. Like that's how they interpret the meaning of the phrase. And again, not all of them, right? So first takeaway, strong majority, 2/3, but then still you get more than 10% for each of the other 3. So first takeaway, Jewish students, majority of them have this interpretation, but then also there is some significant diversity among Jewish students about how they interpret this phrase. Okay, we go to Muslim students, and it's close to kind of a mirror image in some ways, where not a majority, but a decently strong plurality, most common thing that they think of when they hear the statement, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," Muslim students feel like that means Palestinians and Israelis should live in two separate countries side by side. So this would be in line with what many of us refer to as the two-state solution, which if you're unfamiliar with what that means, you can look online, but you can also check out some of my prior talks. In a basic sense, it means Israel as a secure, recognized state, pretty much where it is today, and then a state of Palestine making up most, if not all, of the West Bank and Gaza, kind of living side by side each other. So that's what a plurality of Muslim students think this phrase means. Now, there's significant differences among Muslim students. In fact, even less uniformity in some ways than the Jewish students, because you have another 34%, about a third, saying Palestinians and Israelis should live together in one state. So this is what many of us refer to as a one-state solution. And again, there's not just one-state solution. In fact, again, if you refer to my prior talks, there's vastly different one-state solutions. If you're asking, say, Itamar Ben-Gvir versus you're asking, say, leaders of Hamas versus you're asking, say, people who support a, binational democratic single state, which, could be what this one is signaling, although, again, it doesn't go into full detail. But in a basic sense, if you combine those two, you get 76% of Muslim students who are saying, this phrase to me does not mean, the expulsion of Jews or the genocide of Jews. It means either separate states of Israel and Palestine or Israelis and Palestinians living together in one state, with people not being expelled. So vastly different percentages from Muslim students to Jewish students. And then again, only 14% of Muslim students saying that this actually means expulsion or genocide. Now, again, that's non-zero, right? Just as with Jewish students, there's 12% who say, oh, I hear the phrase, I think it means two-state solution, or 11% who hear it and think that means one-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side, but still a much smaller minority than answers to the other ones. Now, let's pull back a bit and look at all students. This one is fascinating to me because, to be honest, this is not perfectly equal, but pretty strong indication that across all students, there are widely varying opinions and interpretations of this phrase, right? So the most common thing that all students say is they don't know what the phrase means. So that's very interesting, right? Because again, when you talk to activists or you see people debate about this phrase online, they're not usually people that are fitting into this category, right? And so that's one of the things about our discourse is that sometimes many of us who I know are on this call maybe feel like, I'm not an expert on Israeli-Palestinian issues. I don't speak Hebrew or Arabic. I haven't spent years living in the region or doing research or anything like that. And then when I see people talk about this online or otherwise, they're so passionate about it, they seem like, or at least act like, they know everything about it. And yet in reality, I don't feel like I understand that much. And to be honest, that's the majority of students I have in my classes as well. I teach classes right now at BC on Israeli-Palestinian politics. And I have students who are very knowledgeable, some of whom have personal ties to the region, right? They may be Israeli, may be Palestinian, they may have family, etc. But the majority of the students I have, this is like the first class they've taken in Middle East politics, and they care a great deal, but they don't necessarily have all of this background. And so this 31% of the broader student population, I find to be eminently believable that, the most common answer for the average student is to say, I'm not really sure what this phrase means. Then you get almost identical percentages, 27%, 26% saying, oh, I think it means expulsion and genocide of the Jews, or, oh, I think it means two-state solution. So again, interesting breakdown in terms of, about a quarter of all students kind of aligning with the majority Jewish student perspective, and about a quarter of all students aligning with the plurality, Muslim perspective. And then again, the smallest percentage, 16% saying, oh, I think this means kind of like the one-state solution in one form or another. So what are the key things we want to take away from this poll? To me, first and foremost, again, anyone who says, I know what this phrase means, everyone else agrees with me, and everyone else knows it and hears it that same way is wrong. It's just wrong. So what you need to know first and foremost is, unless everyone in this poll is lying, which again, to me is kind of impossible because it's an anonymous poll, so I don't know what the incentive would be here, but also the lying is not all in one direction, right? So people are lying in some ways across 4 different ones, and this is hundreds of people. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that that would be the case. Doesn't mean that these numbers are perfect. Again, any poll should be questioned. We should look into the wording. We should look in if it replicates in other polls, etc. But in a basic sense, I'm pretty comfortable saying that there are widely different interpretations of this phrase. And one's identity seems to have some impact on how this phrase is interpreted. So that to me is takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is, if we're talking about certain populations like Jewish students, to have 2/3 of a population feel like this phrase means the expulsion or genocide of the Israeli Jewish population, To me, that links back to the prior slide that I just showed, right? Which is one of the reasons that Jewish students, majority of them feel in danger, maybe things like hearing phrases like this if they think this is what it signals. So, that's a very worrying thing, and it's a very important thing to understand. It's also important to note, for Muslim students, if a majority or at least a plurality of them, excuse me, feel like what this means is two-state solution, this can also explain some of the logic of, okay, people are saying this phrase. And again, on average, not all Muslim students are supportive of Palestinians are saying this phrase. Not all Jewish students are not saying this phrase or not. But in general, probably the proportions are going along those lines a bit. If you have some Muslim students who are chanting this phrase and it's upsetting significant numbers of Jewish students, you can see why there could be a disconnect there, right? For some, I think there probably is an agreement that maybe, Muslim students are chanting it and they do think, oh, this is one state solution, or maybe for a small percentage here, like, oh, yes, this does mean, expulsion of the Jews from Israel. But for a larger number of Muslim students, they say that no, what I'm saying when I say this is for Palestinian rights or for two-state solution or otherwise, whereas for Israeli students, they're hearing that as no, what that means is genocide or expulsion. So very important to understand, this poll at least suggests that there can be a disconnect here, which one can take in a negative way of saying that, so then people are saying things that are hurting others or that are implying something that, upsets them. But if there's a positive, it could be, well, this is maybe not a situation, certainly in all cases at least, where people are saying something on which they agree on the term, and this side is saying something that's hateful to this other side or otherwise. Some of it can be, well, this group or some of these individuals are saying something that to them means this thing, which is maybe not so objectionable or even has supporters on the other side. But people on the other side hear it another way, which to them is incredibly objectionable or problematic. So to some extent, there's some degree of misunderstanding or differing interpretations here. Doesn't mean that that's a perfectly solvable situation, but it is one that if we're trying to understand, terminology used and the impact that it has, et cetera, we need to go to information like this to both understand how people are using the term, but also how people are receiving it, because I think both are important. Now, you may say, okay, well, Peter, that's a poll about how people are perceiving and interpreting the term, but it doesn't exactly say what they mean when they say it. Although, again, to me, I think those are pretty linked things. If you're saying this is what you think when you hear the term, then probably when you're saying you're not meaning something different. But nonetheless, okay, we've got some other polls. Ron Hassner, who's a great professor at University of California, Berkeley, did a poll early on asking about this phrase as well. Surveyed a bunch of students across the US, found a significant amount of support for the phrase and then some mixed support and then some opposition. What he found was 47% of the students who said they supported the slogan were unable to identify Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea in terms of, the territories or the bodies of water that are being referenced there. Then, when a number of those students were shown a map suggesting that the chant would represent potentially a single state of Palestine on the territory, a number of them have said, no, actually, what I support is a two-state solution, which again would be in line with some of the data from the prior poll, where you have some people, again, not all, but some people who are saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What they're supportive of is a two-state solution. So again, this poll to me also suggests diversity of views in terms of support or opposition, diversity of ways of understanding what the phrase means, and then, yes, a significant number of people who, again, don't know, just like with the prior one. Now, to be clear, there's probably a difference here between, activists and student leaders versus those in the general population. I think people who are, actively pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian probably have a higher level of understanding and knowledge. And so I would think that these percentages would be much lower of those who don't understand or think they know what this phrase means than the general population. But again, when we're looking for data from public opinion or otherwise, one of the things that we can do is triangulate across and look at if we're getting similar findings from multiple polls. And to me, these multiple polls, and there may even be more that we could look into, again, are suggesting diversity of views, diversity of interpretations, some general lack of knowledge, which at least says to me there's a place for education. There's also hopefully a place for, discussion and understanding, because to me, if I'm saying a phrase, like I care about what it means, but I also care about how other people interpret it and what it impacts them, especially if they're a population that, I care about or in my community. So to me, this is not the end of the discussion, but looking at polls like this can maybe be a helpful beginning across communities to understand both how people use, interpret, and respond to these types of slogans, these types of words. The final thing I'll say is, beyond polls, we can, of course, also look at well, how do actors in the region actually utilize this phrase or reference it? Because that's important too, right? It's not just how Americans, which these polls are asked, interpret this stuff, but also how do Palestinians and Israelis and different political parties or militant groups use this stuff? So in the case of Hamas, they ultimately had, their current leader, Khaled Mashal, and well, likely current leader in many ways, because we've had the recent killing of Ismail Haniyeh as well as Yahya Sinwar. But he said at the group's 25th anniversary founding, so the group was founded in the late 80s, quote, Palestine is ours from the river to the sea and from the south to the north. There will be no concession on any inch of the land. And again, there's exceptions which we can talk about, but in general, one of the reasons Hamas has become a more prominent group in the past, 25, 30, 35 plus years is that it has strongly been in opposition to the Oslo Accords, to recognizing Israel, to negotiating with Israelis along the lines of the two-state solution. And, the Oslo Accords, both in the Palestinian population and the Israeli population, have become less popular over time. Populations become disillusioned with them. So again, in the broad sense, Hamas has used this term from the river to the sea, and their general, goal that they've tried to achieve is saying Palestine is a waqf, it can't be negotiated over, like this is the state that we're pushing for. Now, there were a couple statements and things in 2018 or otherwise where they signaled a hudna or long-term ceasefire amidst kind of a recognition of a two-state solution, but there's a lot of skepticism, especially post October 7th, of whether Hamas would ever agree to something like that. So again, in terms of some of their phrasing, it's important to look at historically what they've said. It's also not just Hamas on the Palestinian side. If you look back to the PLO charter, they amended it a couple times, but you can look at the one from 64 or 68. Again, you can find these online. The PLO charter explicitly said, yes, some of the Jewish population can stay in the territory when ultimately in their goal, the state of Palestine is achieved, but it's only Jews who came by 1947 initially or later to those who became, kind of before the initial waves of Aliyah from the early Zionist movement in the early 1900s, they would be considered Palestinians, but the rest would generally not be able to stay in the territory. So again, there are statements from these organizations, in some cases have not been formally amended, that are in line with the idea of all of this will be Palestine, we're using this term, or the Jewish population to varying degrees, some, if not all of it, will have to kind of leave from the perspective of these organizations. Now, on the Israeli side, you see less of this terminology, but if there is an organization that has used versions of it historically, it's Herut or Likud. So current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's party and some of its predecessors under Menachem Begin and others. And again, you can see some of the symbol from the organization, and then similar to the Irgun or Etzel, which was the armed group that represented the revisionist Zionists before 48. And again, see my prior lectures if you want to hear more about this. But Likud published a version of this slogan in various eras, saying that between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, there will be only Israeli sovereignty. So again, in a broader sense, this group actually initially was pushing, as you can see on the map there, not just for Israel, current present-day Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, but also what was then Transjordan, later the state of Jordan. So again, you have had multiple parties who have had kind of more maximalist territorial claims. In some cases, they've been attenuated over time. And, again, the PLO did recognize Israel under the Oslo Accords. So even though they have this, goal in their charter, later on, they recognized Israel in the mid-90s as a state. Likud has never kind of openly advocated for a Palestinian state, and actually they've been active with the recent Knesset vote to say we don't support a two-state solution. But at various points, Netanyahu has made speeches where he said he supports a Palestinian state, although what it actually looks like is another broader question. He was involved in the Oslo negotiations in the mid-90s to varying degrees. So again, important to look at the statements of these organizations, but also recognize that in some cases, those stances can change based on reality or based on, the incentives for that organization at the time. So something else worth thinking about. Okay, so to wrap up kind of this little intro section, then we'll go into some of these other words more deeply. Words matter, right? That's the whole purpose of this talk, is to say terminology matters. It's not just the facts and developments on the ground, although of course I think that's the most important thing, the challenges and the suffering that Israelis and Palestinians have been experiencing, especially in the past year or so, but also the words that we use to describe the situation or to advocate for policies also matter. People have different meanings and interpretations for these terms. And even if, again, you feel so confident that like, I have the one true definition, my definition is correct, etc., others will disagree. Trust me, I'm a scholar who writes about terrorism and political violence, who writes about territorial change, who writes about nationalism. And even among academics who have studied this stuff for generations, it's not like there's consensus and everybody agrees on this stuff, even though people are incredibly knowledgeable about history, about language, all of these things. So important to have a little humility, however you feel about this stuff. And again, your terminology and your language may be the best one, but you need to have some humility about the fact that there are going to be people who are going to disagree with you. And if your goal at the end of the day is to get through to those people or have them understand you, even if you're going to be rivals or disagree on things, you need to understand that there's different ways people can define and interpret and react to different terminology. So that's a good first step, and I hope that's one of the things we can take away from today. All of this fits within this book that I'm writing, which is called How to Have a Constructive Conversation on Israel and Palestine. I hope it's going to be out sometime next year, but I'm, working my way through. I've written almost all the chapters, got a couple more to go. But in a basic sense, this conversation today fits within this, right? Because constructive conversation to me is we have mutual discussion, we have active listening, we're engaging with multiple perspectives, even if that doesn't mean we're agreeing with all those perspectives. Our goal is not to win. Our goal is to learn and to connect. We're trying to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. When people say things that offend us or are problematic, which inevitably will happen, our goal is not to like call those people out and humiliate them and exclude them, but at least initially try to call them in, as Loretta Ross, coined a phrase from Smith. She's excellent in giving grace to your conversation partners. Now, ultimately, things may not work out and you may have to pause or break off the conversation, but initially trying to give grace in that sense and have good faith engagement, which you treat people around you with respect. To be clear, this does not mean that constructive conversation lacks disagreement and debate. It has it. Again, today's talk is going to be all about how different people disagree on these terms and the use of them. It doesn't mean the conversation's emotionless. It doesn't mean we all agree at the end. It doesn't mean you should hold back your opinions. It doesn't mean we avoid tough topics. As you've seen already, like I just went right at, arguably the most controversial and debated phrase that's being used these days on college campuses. So we're not going to avoid those things. And this is not the only acceptable form of engagement. Like protest is an acceptable form of engagement. Like advocating for policy differences among U.S. policy or otherwise, like those are, real things that, we have freedoms to do. It just means that some of the time there's also great value in trying to have constructive conversation with people around us, whether they're in quote unquote our community or other communities or those that we agree with or disagree with. So that's what I'm trying to model here with these talks. And I think it's good, again, regardless of what you're trying to do. If you're frustrated by, dead end conversations on this stuff where it seems like people never understand each other and everything ends in fights and, you have to break off relationships with people you care about, or you're trying to understand someone else's beliefs, even if you don't agree with them, or you're trying to change someone's mind or government policy, or, you want to engage, but you're really scared because you're someone who's either in the middle or you feel like you don't know that much. And so it's like, ooh, I don't even want to get involved in these discussions because I feel like I'm just going to be taking fire from all sides. Or you want to protest more effectively or win a debate or negotiation. I've been involved in track two negotiations, and I will tell you the most effective people in those negotiations, again, these negotiations include Israelis and Palestinian delegations. I've been part of the American delegation, is people who understand the language of the other community and they understand their concerns and they understand how they define and interpret this stuff and what matters to them. It's not the people who are kind of like, my way or the highway. This is the only way to interpret this thing. I'm just going to try to impose this on you. And I don't brook any difference of opinion or different ways of talking about things or otherwise. Like those people are quite ineffective, to be honest, in advocating for their communities, in my experience. So why don't these conversations happen? I think there's a whole list of things, right? We've got competing claims to the same territory. We have a tragic history for the Israeli and Jewish and Palestinian peoples. There's ongoing conflict and death, as we've seen around us every day, even before October 7th, but certainly since then, this has been the deadliest period in the Israeli-Palestinian and broader Arab-Israeli conflict, in the past 100 years. There's a lack of deep knowledge. This is something where the situation is very personal and emotional for many people. And again, as I mentioned, sometimes the goal is not to have a constructive conversation. It is to spread a message or try to change policy or otherwise. Our focus today, though, is going to be here, which is one of the reasons I think we don't have constructive conversations, is because there are these very sensitive or contested words that for many people either are kind of the stopping point of a conversation, or they're the points of the conversation where the conversation goes off a cliff, where it's just kind of like, okay, we're having a decent exchange of ideas, but then someone used the words terrorism or someone used the words occupation or does this, and now we're just fighting about something else, or we're getting very emotional and angry about it, and now we can't really engage anymore, and that's the end of it, right? So that's what we're trying to go at today. So let me start by asking you a series of questions, which is, have you had an experience like this? Have you ever had a time in which the use of a single word derailed a conversation? Have you ever had a time where, again, you're discussing Israel and Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians, and you spent so much time just debating and focusing on the meaning of a word instead of the issue at hand, which is what you really wanted to get to? Have you ever said a word and have it not be received or understood in the way that you intended? I'm sure you have. What about the reverse? Have you ever heard a word that someone else used and you did not receive it or understand it the way they seemingly intended it to be received or understood? And then finally, have you ever, sometimes people use the term code switch, but more in a broader sense, like, have you ever just avoided using a certain word because you thought it wasn't going to be received well or understood by your conversation partner, or other people in the community? Have you used different words when you're talking to different communities? If you said yes to any of these things, and I can pretty much guarantee you've said yes to at least one of them, if not all of them, then again, today's talk is for you because this is not uncommon. I see this all the time, both in my classrooms, in the facilitations that I lead with Israelis and Palestinians, in my time, living in the region, whether in Israel, the West Bank, Jordan, elsewhere, doing research, doing interviews. Language matters. Language is really important. And so today, again, it's just going to be a small little dive in because there's hundreds of words and language issues we could talk about, but I want to go through some really important ones. And so we're going to do that right now. Um, why do some of these words trigger emotional reactions, especially the ones we're going to talk about today? First off, a lot of them are referencing violence, or they're referencing dispossession, or they're referencing death. And so I think as natural as human beings, those are going to be terms that are going to inspire intense emotions in people. I'm certainly, again, as a professor, and you've seen my talks before, you may feel like, how can this guy be so calm while talking about all of these challenging things? It's not because I'm not emotional about them. As I've mentioned in prior talks, I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Muslim, I'm not Jewish, but I do have hundreds of friends, Israelis and Palestinians and colleagues who I've gotten to know over the years that I care a great deal about. And this conflict is personal to me. And so when we talk about these terms that, imply or reference the killing of people that I care about in a region that means a great deal to me, like, I'm emotional. So understandable if you feel the same. Secondly, these terms, as I mentioned, have multiple, often contested definitions. Again, in my classes, we spend multiple classes talking about how have different people defined these terms, what is the historical context for where these terms come from, how they're used, etc. So that can trigger emotional reactions, right? Because again, just the misunderstanding or the feeling like you're saying something, but the person's not understanding you or not agreeing with how you're interpreting something, like that can make you emotional. And then finally, if we're using a term like terrorism or occupation, like I don't think there's too many people who like that term and want it to be applied to them. Now, as we'll talk about, when terrorism was, originated as a term, which was during the French Revolution, it actually was used positively. It was used by the people who were saying, we are using la terreur to actually cleanse the French Republic of, monarchy and, these terrible rulers who have oppressed us. But over the years, and especially for at least the past, 100 years or so, the term terrorism has pretty much entirely a negative connotation. There's no one who proudly says, yes, I'm a terrorist, and that label, applies to me. Whereas you can go back to the anarchists in the 19th century, and many of them were using that label to describe themselves. So again, terms don't stay the same over time in terms of how they're defined and how they're used. And the connotation for them also changes. Sometimes is positive, sometimes is negative. So we need to make sure we understand that. And again, that can also mean that people can apply them inconsistently. And this is certainly a concern of both Palestinians and Israelis in terms of how politicians or how the media, selectively apply in their perspective some of these terms just to their community, but not to the other community or vice versa. So that can certainly trigger people or make people feel angry or emotional. So let's start with this first term, terrorism. And I teach a class at BC right now called Terrorism and Political Violence, which studies the history of terrorism, both on the non-state side and the state side, talking about the intentional killing of civilians. And again, we'll get into the parts of the definition here, but right from the outset, think about it, because you've probably used this term before, and you've definitely heard the term terrorism before. But just say to yourself for a minute, just pause the video. How do you define terrorism? Like if you had to write a 1 or 2 sentence definition for it, like what would it include? What would be the elements? Just think for just a moment. Now, if you did that, you just did the first assignment that my students do for my terrorism and political violence class. Before they even come to a class, before they even hear anything from me or read anything, I ask them to send me a 1 to 2 sentence definition of terrorism. And then I do a couple of things with it when we come into class. I create a word cloud, which you don't know what that means. It makes a word bigger or smaller based on how many people use a word. So we see what are the most common elements of the terrorism definition across the class, but you also see the diversity of opinions there. I give them an anonymized sheet that shows different people's definitions, and then we see again the different ways that people define this stuff. And then we start to look at different scholars' definitions, different politicians' definitions, different practitioners, right? So people in the military or in non-state armed groups and how they've defined this term historically. So step one is just to say, even if I use this term, how many of us really think about how we actually define it in a clear and systematic way? And then also think about, do you actually use the term in a clear and systematic way? Or is it applied more to certain populations or in certain contexts? Like, we'll get more into this, but these are really important things to do that I don't think most of us take these steps. We just kind of use these terms without being conscientious about them. So let's look at some examples. Here's a quote. It's a quote from an important historical figure in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So let me read this, and then you can try to guess who you think said this. Our enemies called us terrorists. We were not terrorists. The historical and linguistic origins of the political term terror prove that it cannot be applied to a revolutionary war of liberation. We arose to rebel and fight, not in order to instill fear, but to eradicate it. We were strictly speaking anti-terrorists. Who do you think said this? The answer is Menachem Begin. If you don't know who Menachem Begin is, he's actually the guy, or one of the guys, who led this group, the Etzel or the Irgun, when they were fighting and using violence in the late 30s and early 40s, simultaneously in various points to push the British out of the mandate for Palestine so they could establish the state of Israel, but also attacking and killing, Palestinians, whether Palestinians in armed groups or in some cases targeting Palestinian civilians as part of their broader struggle for the Zionist cause and establishing the state of Israel. And as you can see, this is a group who territorially was claiming quite a large piece of territory. And then their symbol is like holding a hand with a rifle, saying in Hebrew, only thus, basically, like Jabotinsky said with the Iron Wall, like this is the only way we're going to be able to achieve this. It's not going to be welcomed by the local population. We need to kind of recognize this. And then in some of his memoirs of sorts, book called The Revolt, Begin wrote about this period and said, well, actually, when we were doing this stuff, including killing, Palestinian civilians, like we were not terrorists because this was a revolutionary war of liberation for the Jewish people on their homeland historically, for the Zionist cause to have found Israel. Again, if you want to know more about this, look at some of my prior talks. What's fascinating about Begin is, of course, he was not just the leader during this period of this group and then of revisionist Zionism, but he became prime minister of Israel in 1977, the first right-wing prime minister of Israel after the Zionist left dominated and the labor Zionists dominated for almost the first 3 decades of the state from 48 to 77. So fascinating to have a sitting prime minister kind of write about his time when he was, a non-state armed actor who is, committing violent acts and commanding violent acts, and then this is his interpretation. Okay, let's look at another quote, again from an important historical figure in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The difference between the revolutionary and the terrorist lies in the reason for which each fights. Whoever stands by a just cause and fights for freedom and liberation of his land from invaders, settler and colonialists of his land, would have been incorrectly called terrorist. The American people and their struggle for liberation from the British colonialists would have been terrorists. The European, sorry, I have a little bit of cough. The European resistance against the Nazis would be terrorism. The struggle of the Asian, African, and Latin American peoples would also be terrorism. As to those who fight against just causes, those who wage war to occupy the homelands of others and to plunder, exploit, and colonize their peoples, those are the people whose actions should be condemned, who should be called war criminals. For the just cause determines the right to struggle. Who do you think said this? The answer is Yasser Arafat, the leader of Fatah, later on the leader of the PLO, later the president of the Palestinian Authority, kind of the Palestinian semi-government in waiting, who was part of the negotiations in the Oslo process. And to be honest, an avowed enemy of Begin, right? They hated each other. They would probably easily define the other as a terrorist, certainly that he did. And yet what's fascinating is that when you look at Arafat talking about Fatah, which again, both launched attacks against the Israeli military, but also launched attacks against Israeli civilians and killed a number of them, he's making the argument that we, Fatah and Palestinians who are part of Al-Asifa initially, but other parts of the armed wing of Fatah, um, we are not terrorists. Why? Because it's about the justness of the cause. And from his perspective, we Palestinians and Fatah have a just cause. And therefore, our violence is part of, again, kind of like a revolutionary war of liberation, national war of liberation. Therefore, we're not terrorists. So interestingly, both Begin and Arafat said, we are not terrorists when we were killing members of armed groups, but also civilians from other communities. And the main reason is because we have a just cause, which is a war of liberation. Fascinating, right? Because these are two guys on the opposite sides of the fight who thinks the other is a terrorist and a sworn enemy, and yet somewhat similar definitions implicitly and explicitly for terrorism, and certainly how they apply the term to them or not to themselves. Now, you may say, okay, well, that's just a couple people writing, what about the broader Israeli Palestinian population? Well, guess what? There's a poll. There's often a poll. This is a very, 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 very interesting study. This is jointly done by Jacob Shamir and Khalil Shakaki, who are excellent Israeli and Palestinian pollsters. They did a series of polls. In fact, Shakaki is the one that I recommend to you as the best Palestinian pollster who continues to do polls of Palestinian public opinion in the West Bank, Gaza, and elsewhere. Jacob Shamir via Tel Aviv, and you could look at other great Israeli pollsters like Dalia Shendlin, poll Israelis. But this is a fascinating poll about the definition of terrorism, and more particularly the application of the term terrorism. So what happened here is that the two authors polled hundreds of Israelis and Palestinians, and they asked them about 11 different incidents that some people might qualify as terrorism. So for each incident, Goldstein incident, Abu Ali Mustafa assassination, shooting on the Gilo neighborhood, Nahariya incident, the 9/11 attacks. So again, some of these are more familiar to you than others. They then ask people, do you perceive this act as terrorism? And the gray columns are the percentage of that population that said yes. So for Israeli Jews, 19% of them said this attack was terrorism. 100% of them said this attack was terrorism. Then it's Palestinians. Again, this is Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. 98% of them are saying that this attack is terrorism. 15% of them are saying that this attack is terrorism. Then there's also this other population, Israeli Arabs, also labeled Palestinian citizens of Israel. Again, people identified differently. Again, look at prior talks if you want to see me talk more about this population. But this population makes up about 21% of Israel's population today. And you can see the percentage of them that say this attack is terrorism, this attack's terrorism. Each group and individual is also asked, what percentage of the world population do you think defines this element or this attack as terrorism? So in this case, 19% of Israelis think that this is terrorism, but 53% of them think that the world defines it as terrorism, right? And then similar for Palestinians, 92% of them say this is a terrorist attack, but then only 28% of them think that the world, broader opinion, thinks that it's a terrorist attack. Okay. Final thing to look at this poll. Again, it's a complex poll, but it's a fascinating one. This column right here, in parentheses, is the perpetrator's identity. And again, you can see the key here at the bottom. So these first four attacks that say IS means that it was committed by Israelis. PAL, these are 3 attacks committed by Palestinians. IA means an attack committed by an Israeli Arab. So again, this is someone who has Israeli citizenship, but ethnically is Arab or nationally is Palestinian, again, depending on how one identifies. Then we have 2 foreign attacks, right? The Pan Am Lockerbie plane explosion and then the 9/11 attacks. And then the anthrax incidents, which at least at the time this was being asked, it was unknown who the perpetrator was. So again, complex poll, but fascinating one. Again, pause the video for a moment and just look this over and try to think about what are the patterns you see here and what are the key takeaways in terms of comparing how these different populations have defined each incident as terrorism or not as terrorism. Okay, so hopefully you pause the video. If not, you didn't really have enough time there, but let's talk about it. First thing I see, look at the percentages of Israelis and Palestinians who define incident as terrorism, depending on who the perpetrator is. So on the Israeli side, we have 4 incidents committed by Israelis. The average percent of Israelis who are saying those are terrorism is somewhere in the 30s. And for most of them, it's under 20%, right? There's this one kind of outlier, which we'll talk about in a minute, the Goldstein incident. But overall, a minority of Israelis define these incidents as terrorism on average. Whereas the incidents committed by Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, almost unanimity, right? 100% of Israelis say the Dolphinarium incident was terrorism. That was a suicide bombing by Hamas at a nightclub on the Tel Aviv beach, which was held in what used to be kind of like a Dolphinarium, like a SeaWorld type scenario. 96%, 90%, 99%, right? And then Palestinians, almost a mirror image, where they say over 90% for all four of the incidents committed by Israelis were terrorism. But then for all four incidents committed by Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, under 20%, and 15% or less for most of the time, saying those are terrorism. So first key takeaway, people say it's terrorism if it's the other community against their community, but they often don't say it's terrorism if it's someone from their community against the other community. And again, to some extent, that aligns with what we saw from Arafat and Begin in terms of saying, well, what we did is not terrorism, and here's why. But then again, I didn't have this in quotes, but certainly you can find Begin and others saying, Arafat's a terrorist, he did this. And to some extent, that's what you're seeing in this broader poll. Now, other interesting observations. Each community does have something in common, which is they both think the world disagrees with them or is against them, right? So even when Israelis are saying this is not terrorism, they think a slight majority of the world thinks it is. Similar for Palestinians, when they're saying these attacks by Palestinians are not terrorist attacks, well, guess what? They think the whole world thinks it is. So, and again, this is something that goes to today as well. When you see Israelis talk about the UN, today, the vast majority of them will say, oh, the UN disproportionately is biased against us. They criticize us for things like we get more anti-Israel resolutions at the UN than any other state. And then if you talk to Palestinians or look at Palestinians posting online, they'll say, the world doesn't care about our lives. We've had tens of thousands of Palestinians dead in Gaza, and what has the world done? Pretty much nothing. They apply the label of terrorism to us, but not to others. So again, both of these populations feel like the world is against them, but then also they basically will say, again, not everybody. So even for Israelis, you get a fifth of Israelis who are saying these attacks by Israelis are terrorism. And for Palestinians, you get maybe not a fifth, but like a sixth or a seventh, depending on the number here, of Palestinians who say these are terrorism, right? So strong majorities going seemingly based on identity, but then again, some who may still have a consistent definition they're applying across them. Okay. Outlier, we have the Goldstein incident, and this is an interesting one, right? This is when Baruch Goldstein, I talked about in a prior talk, he was a settler living around Hebron. He went into the tomb of the patriarchs at the Ibrahimi Mosque, this place where Abraham and his descendants and family are buried. Very holy place to Jews and to Muslims. Different times of day, Jews are allowed to worship in there. Other times of day, Muslims are allowed to worship in there. But he went into there in 1994 and machine gunned and killed 29 Palestinians and wounded hundreds of others before eventually he was beaten to death after his gun, kind of jammed or was reloading. So you still have actually a majority of Israelis saying that this is a terrorist attack. And this gets into a little bit of the Israeli mindset regarding the term, because again, not all Israelis are the same on this stuff, but one of the key distinctions is that these incidents in general are committed by the IDF or the Israeli military. Whereas this one is committed by an Israeli civilian, and not just a civilian, but a settler. And so in that broad sense, I think that's probably why you get a higher percentage of Israelis saying that this is terrorism. Whereas generally, Israelis are not going to qualify any act by the IDF as terrorism, even if civilians are killed, or even if it's, intentional killing of civilians. That's not going to be qualified as terrorism by the vast majority of Israelis. For Palestinians, one of the key claims that they will make is terrorism can be committed both by state actors and by non-state actors. So again, there is some difference there of opinion in terms of the definition. Other interesting observations on this score. When we look at foreign attacks, again, this reinforces to me the idea that the identity of the perpetrator matters. When it's an unknown attacker, like the anthrax instance, you actually get majorities of both Israelis and Palestinians saying that it's terrorism. So again, getting to the idea that unknown, but unlikely an Israeli or Palestinian, both communities saying it's terrorism. What's the discrepancy there? I would say some of it comes to the fact that, again, terrorism in Hebrew and for Israelis is a commonly used term. You see it in Israeli media all the time, and it's commonly applied. For Palestinians, the Arabic term, irhabi, like it's used, but it has much more of not just negative connotation, but again, kind of a feeling of like this is applied to our population, but not as much to others. So I think that probably also says something. I also think it comes to the fact of how each of these populations feels about the United States. I think the Israelis, again, in general, are going to be more pro, American or pro-US, certainly pro-US government than the Palestinians are. So I think that that also is filtering it a bit into the discrepancy here in terms of what percentage are saying this is terrorism. And again, how many of these things are actually about whether an attack is terrorism? Like what we're focusing on in many ways is the identity of the person who committed it or the identity of the target. For most academic or systematic definitions, those are not the important elements. Certainly not one's ethnicity or national identity or, the national identity of the state. We might say state versus non-state actor, the type, but in terms of the actual identity and whether we like that person or group or don't, that should not be filtering into systematic definitions. But for many people, it seems to do that. Final thing, looking at the Israeli Arab population, which again is fascinating, they actually qualify, or a majority of them actually qualify every single incident here as terrorism. So I don't know, again, if you want to spin this positively or negatively, but if I want to spin it positively, I could say, A, this does allude to the fact that sometimes this population is seen as a quote unquote bridge community where their citizenship is Israeli, but their nationality for most of them is Palestinian. So, again, people have different loyalties or support here or there, and you could look into, great polls on this population. But interesting there that, to the extent you want to say, this and this is evidence of bias, it does seem like this population seems to be pretty consistent about, okay, these incidents were picked by the authors as trying to have some similarities. Of course, nothing's perfect, but kind of make it more apples to apples comparisons. And then you have the Israeli Arab population saying, yes, this is targeting of civilians and killing of civilians for political ends, and so is this, and so both of them are terrorism. So interesting again, how the identity of the person who is naming the definition and applying it and the identity of the people who are involved has some impact. Although again, depending on how your identity does or does not match up with these different ones, you can have different outcomes, which you see across these columns. So again, to me, this is a fascinating study. I commend it to you to look at it more broadly. But again, looking at this poll, I think tells you a lot about how there are differences of opinion on what terrorism means and certainly how it's applied. There's biases people have about that. And it's important to understand that. Now, you might have looked at that and just said, that's not how I am. I have a perfectly consistent, clear definition. I apply it fairly and justly to anyone that applies to, like, that's not me. And I'll tell you, are you sure about that? And I'll tell you for me, I've had to ask that question to myself as a scholar of political violence and terrorism, because when I was in college, when I was a senior in college, and I say this to my students, the first week of my senior year is when the 9/11 attacks happened. And I was already a political science and history major. I was already focused on, Middle East politics. But when that attack happened, like it certainly affected me. I actually had, lived in New York and was working in the World Trade Center like a couple weeks before the 9/11 attacks happened. And, it affected me. I'm a patriotic American, even though I have a lot of, critiques of US foreign policy. I'm a proud American. And, certainly I felt a lot of emotions for the loss of life and particularly all the civilian lives that were lost on that day. And so when I looked at Al Qaeda, it wasn't really a question for me. I didn't support their means and I didn't support their ends. And so to me, to say Al Qaeda is a terrorist group or to say like I condemn everything about Al Qaeda 9/11 was an easy thing for me because I don't support their goal of a broader, quote unquote extremist interpretation of an Islamic State, nor do I support their, means of doing so, of targeting, civilian targets like the World Trade Center. So that was pretty easy for me. And then with my research, I haven't just studied Middle East politics for my first book. I also did a case study in Northern Ireland. I spent time living in Belfast, and I interviewed, former members of the IRA, as well as other militant groups on the Republican side and on the Loyalist side. And, I'm part Irish American. And what's interesting is to think, when I grew up, I definitely heard a lot about, and like on St. Patrick's Day, it wasn't just like, oh, people want to drink. Like it's like, hey, let's talk about the repression of the Irish people and their fight for independence and equal rights for Catholics in Northern Ireland. Like those are things that I had heard growing up and that, were things that in some distant way, at least, I mattered to me. And I was never a supporter of the IRA or anything like that, but it was certainly interesting to go and live there and interview people and see, even today, some of the discrimination and things that people face, and look at a situation where maybe I agreed with the ends of some of the nationalist organizations, those who are pushing for, equal rights for Catholics or even for, the independence or Northern Ireland becoming part of Ireland, right? Like those are things that weren't fully antithetical to things that I had been raised to think or, had been supportive of. But then at the same time, still be aghast at and totally against the targeting of civilians that the IRA and other groups, both on the Republican and Loyalist side, did. So having a situation where you support the ends of an organization, but you don't potentially support the means, I think really forces you to come face to face with how you actually do define terrorism or how you actually do condemn or not condemn violence. And if you say, hey, I'm not supportive of Israeli Palestinian nationalism or Irish nationalism, okay, take any cause almost. Take the environmental movement, right? And I show my students a great documentary called If a Tree Falls. I recommend it to you. It's outstanding. It looks at a group called the ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, who is against logging old growth trees, against global warming and drilling oil nonstop, etc. And this was a group in the 1990s who actually committed more attacks, according to the US government, that was qualified as terrorism than any other group, quintuple or more, anything from Al Qaeda or Islamist groups or otherwise, right? Now, they didn't kill people, but they did lots of property damage. They burned down ski lodges. They burned down, logging businesses. Sometimes, late at night when people had just been working there, and some of those people certainly felt threatened by that. So, in a broad sense, I think if you're deciding how you're going to define terrorism and how you're going to apply the term, you have to think through both examples of organizations and incidents where it's like, I hate this group, I hate what they're trying to achieve, what their ends are, and I hate their means. And you have to look at groups where it's like, I support their ends, but now what do I think about their means? And now, will I consistently apply the terrorism definition to this group as much as I will to another group who's doing, this similar, if not the same thing? Only when you do that, in my opinion, can you really have a clear, systematic understanding and definition of the term. And then you really see, are you so unbiased? Are you so able to consistently do this stuff? Or does this poll kind of apply to you too? Where you say, if Israelis are doing it, I think it's just, I think it's understandable. They're counting fire with fire. Like there's not terrorism by Israelis. Or Palestinians, they're fighting for a just cause. They're fighting against occupation. Therefore, it's not terrorism. They have a right under international law to do that. Like no terrorism there, right? So you need to think about these things. Again, you can have those opinions. People can have opinions however they like about how they define and use terms. It's just really being conscientious about, are you being consistent? Are you being clear? And then even if you are other people all going to agree with you? And could you understand why someone might define or apply it differently or receive that term differently? That's really important to understand. Now, final takeaway on terrorism, we'll go to another term, is again, in academia, there is no consensus, everybody agrees with the term. There's a whole field of what's called critical terrorism studies that actually criticizes a lot of more quote unquote conventional or mainstream terrorism studies for how they define the term. The most basic one that I will tell my students, though, to say, if you're reading an article and they're using the term terrorism, they're probably meaning something like this, is the use or threat of violence by a non-state actor against non-combatants to inspire fear or alarm an audience beyond the target. And there's one other element I started to include here, which is for political ends. So 5 elements. The difference in critical terrorism studies versus more conventional is, does it have to be a non-state actor? A lot of critical terrorism scholars will say, no, states can also commit terrorism. Now, conventional terrorism scholars will say, it's not that states can't actively target civilians. They would just say, we have other terms to apply to that. We will apply the term war crime or genocide or things of that nature. And they would also say that states have agreements between each other, whether it's like the Geneva Conventions or other international human rights law, that non-state groups are not beholden to and do not sign. And so that's why we use kind of different terminology regarding them. But again, reasonable people can disagree on that. One of the key things I want you to understand for Israelis and Palestinians is how they would often react to these terms, which is, especially in the past year, many Israelis will say, if you are avoiding this term, especially if you're not saying like Hamas is a terrorist organization or the October 7th attacks are terrorism, many of them will see this as a non-condemnation or even an excuse of the act. Even if you say Hamas killed 1,200 people, mostly Israelis on the day, the majority of them were civilians, etc. If you're not using the term terrorism, many of them will wonder why you're not, or is that somehow excusing or justifying this act? Conversely, on the Palestinian side, even if they agree that October 7th, was a terrorist act or other things like that, they will say, well, the term is not appropriately or proportionally applied to our population as it is to other populations, particularly the Israeli population or others, right? So they'll say, look, if you want to take non-state incidents, look at Tag Mahir, look at price tag in the West Bank, or attacks by settlers against Palestinian civilians, even sometimes against the Israeli military. Like, why is that not labeled as terrorism and treated as such? So important to understand, again, this is a very charged term for these populations and, for many other people as well. So having that understanding, I think, is helpful. In a broader sense, again, I put these slides up here so you can just look through them. But in terms of how Israelis use this term, you can see that the Israeli defense minister can actually use a number of different laws to declare certain organizations unlawful or terrorist organizations, which can include even aid organizations that would support those. So Israeli law has kind of a more expansive definition and application of terrorism than maybe some other states do. On the Palestinian side, again, a lot of it is about this disproportional use of the term. So a popular song from a group called Them, which is a Palestinian rap group, was called Min el Arhabi, which means who is the terrorist? And it kind of goes through, as a lot of rap songs do, kind of through political protests of saying, this has been done to us, this has been done to us, like who is the terrorist in that broad sense. So again, how these different populations kind of view the term, that makes sense. Okay, what about occupation? A term that's used all the time in the Israeli-Palestinian context, often to refer to Israeli military control of the West Bank and Gaza since the 1967 war, which again, I talk about in previous talks. So think again about how do you actually define that term? How do you use that term? How do you perceive or react when you hear that term? In this case, we can start with the international legal definition, which is the effective control of a foreign territory by hostile armed forces. And there's a lot of international law over this stuff and basically says, look, if you are having a military occupation, it's not something that like can never happen. It's just when that happens, there's certainly certain obligations that the state who's occupying the territory has towards the local population. Otherwise, and they're not allowed to do certain things like transfer their civilians into the territory, etc. One of the key debates here is about this term effective control. So effective control is supposed to be based on the idea that you have a physical presence of your foreign military in there that does not have the consent of the local population. There is not a local sovereign that's able to exercise control, and the occupying forces are kind of imposing their authority. Now, the other part of this that gets to be debated among Israelis and Palestinians is this part here, which is foreign territory, right? So for Palestinians, they would say, yes, this is Palestine. And if you want to go in a different way, like Jordan annexed the territory from 48, 49 to 67. So this is not Israeli territory that Israel's controlling in the West Bank. For some Israelis, as I'll discuss, they look at it and say, well, this is not foreign territory for a variety of reasons. But let's start on the Palestinian side this time because we did the reverse before. So Palestinians will generally accept the legal definition I laid out for what, foreign military occupation means. They will say that, hey, the Israeli occupation is not just kind of controlling territory, but it involves settlement, it involves land confiscation. There's discrimination against the Palestinian population, their ability to get permits to build or otherwise in the West Bank and historically in Gaza as well. And there's a lot of frustration among Palestinians with the United States and with the international community about, hey, this is a clear violation of international law. This is not some temporary thing. This has gone on now, for over half a century. And this is the source of a lot of Palestinian hopelessness. Certainly, if you go back to the first Intifada, which again, we'll talk about the term Intifada in a moment, but the first Intifada in many ways is a reaction to this after 20 years of Palestinians living in Gaza on the West Bank, not having citizenship, facing, all of these challenges that are mentioned here, and kind of rising up to try to change that, if that makes sense. Now, to be clear, these are not unitary populations. Like many Israelis also will say, I accept the international legal definition of occupation. I will refer to Israel's control of the West Bank and Gaza, at least during certain periods, as occupation. Whereas there's other Israelis, and again, it's not all left-right, but proportionally, it's kind of this way. More of those on the Israeli right, especially, will say, well, this is not occupation. Because why? This is not actually foreign territory. This is part of Eretz Israel, or part of the Israeli territory or Jewish territory historically, so it's not foreign. Or people will say, yeah, Jordan annexed the territory, but only a couple states in the world actually recognize that. So it was really just part of the Ottoman Empire, but not part of any recognized modern nation state. So long and short, you have differences of opinion here. And look at, one of these polls, 62% of the Jewish public believes Israeli control over. So again, terminology here, we don't have time to go into all of these, but a number of Israelis will not even use the term West Bank. They'll use the term Judea and Samaria, which is kind of more this ancient term that harkens back to periods of Jewish kingdoms. So again, trying to make the connection to the Jewish people's control of the territory, but saying that it's not an occupation. So again, you get a mixed bag. You get a number of Israelis who say it is, a number who say it's not. But again, it comes down to some extent whether this is supposed to be a temporary thing. People disagree on that, or to what extent this is kind of foreign territory. Okay, let's go to Intifada. This is, again, another one, as I showed you at the outset, that has not just been around in the first Intifada and the second Intifada in the late 80s, early 90s, and early 2000s, but also has been renewed in terms of the discourse in the sense that you hear it a lot in campus protests and discussions or otherwise. So think again, and again, some of you may have no idea, but think about how you might define this term or how you might use this term or how you would perceive it when you hear the term Intifada. So let's start on the Israeli side this time. For most Israelis, Intifada evokes violence, and it evokes the fact that there were a series of uprisings against Israelis, particularly the second Intifada, as I'll talk about in just a moment, where for Israelis, Intifada means violence, and it means an attempt to kind of destroy the state of Israel. And you can look at polls that kind of back this up, right? 1990, 86% of Israelis thinks the Intifada was acts of aggression, not self-defense. Close to half thought the main goal was to cause damage and injury, not protest. 80% thinks that this is about the establishment of a Palestinian state by violent means. So generally, negative connotation for Israelis and their supporters, and connotation is kind of violence. For Palestinians, very different. They would say, look, Intifada in Arabic means shaking off, or in kind of other connotations like uprising. They would say, look, when we use the term Intifada, it's kind of hearkening to the idea of kind of a grassroots community advocacy and mobilization as a movement for Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedoms. That's what, the first Intifada was about in most Palestinians' interpretations, is to say these are Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, millions of them who were living under occupation without any state or any citizenship. And so they were kind of rising up with boycotts and marches and otherwise to advocate for those rights. So generally seen as a positive thing for Palestinians, but also has this connotation of it's not top down, it's kind of a bottom up push for solidarity and mobilization. Now, some of the difference of opinion here both comes from, again, like who's doing the thing and who's, the target of the thing, but some of it comes from historical difference, which is, again, if you look at my prior talks, you can see discussion of this stuff. There were actually multiple kind of intifadas. And to be clear, Intifada is not something that just like people say it and it happens or whatever. It's a term that's used at the time or sometimes even in retrospect to kind of say, oh, this was, kind of a broader uprising by the Palestinians in this case against the Israelis. But the two, what we usually refer to with first and second Intifada, were actually quite different in both their level of violence and what came in the aftermath of them. So the first Intifada, which was roughly 1987 to the early 90s, was the one in which the majority of action would have been boycotts, marches, strikes, refusal to pay taxes, acts of kind of civil disobedience or civil resistance. There was still violence. There were about 200 Israelis killed during this period and about 1,000 Palestinians killed. So they're both, attacks by some Palestinian groups as well as attacks from the Israeli military and some Israeli settlers against Palestinians. But what I think is unique about the first Intifada versus the second is, first, the first Intifada was not planned or carried out and led, especially initially, by Fatah or the PLO or Hamas, which was created during this time period. A lot of it was led and mobilized by local Palestinian councils in the West Bank and Gaza. It didn't just take Israeli intelligence by surprise, it took the Palestinian leadership in North Africa by surprise. And then what comes in the aftermath of this? The Oslo peace process, right? The handshake on the White House lawn between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, where the PLO recognized Israel, the Israelis recognized the PLO, and then they started to have negotiations towards what many people thought would be a two-state solution. So First Intifada, in many people's minds, seen as both overall, if not fully nonviolent, then much less violent, more effective in terms of, changing a number of Israelis' minds. Yitzhak Rabin famously said, in the early days of the First Intifada, I've learned something in the past few months. You can't just rule by force over 1.5 million Palestinians like ad infinitum. So in that broad sense, not all Israelis, but a number of Israelis' minds were changed by saying, okay, the occupation is not ultimately sustainable, or it's not good for us morally, or ultimately there are Palestinians on the other side who are reasonable, who we can deal with, even if we have differences of opinion. Second Intifada was different on a number of scores. Now, to be clear, there still were marches and boycotts, etc., but it was a much more violent period. So you had 5 times as many Israelis who were killed. This is when people think about waves of suicide bombing, not just by Hamas, although Hamas did a lot of them, but also Islamic Jihad and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, a group who was affiliated with Fatah. Um, they were killing lots of Israelis, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but also inside of Israel proper. Also, many more Palestinians killed, 3 times as many Palestinians killed in Israeli military attacks and incursions, especially into the West Bank and Gaza, like pictured here. So a much more deadly period, much more violent period. It was dominated in many ways by militant factions, not by kind of grassroots councils. And it was the opposite in terms of the outcome. If the first Intifada created the mobilization for the peace process, the second Intifada in many ways kind of killed or at least significantly weakened the peace process. And you can look at polls among both Israelis and Palestinians during and after the second Intifada. And again, Shamir and Shikaki and other great pollsters do this. You can find the number of people on each community who feel that two-state solution or peace is possible goes way down. Just to wrap up on this slide, how people use the term Intifada is both kind of historically, impacted by the context of the first versus the second. But again, also, regardless of which one is referring to or otherwise, as we saw in prior slides, Israelis and Palestinians react very differently to this term. Unlike terrorism, which for both kind of has a negative connotation for each, but then there's different ways of applying it, Intifada generally has a very negative connotation for Israelis, a pretty positive one for most Palestinians. And so that's some of the disconnect. And then there's also a disconnect in terms of experiences and time periods that one could be hearkening back to. Now, let's take a third term, or fourth term, but a third one in the sense of we've had some terms where each side see as negative, like terrorism, or ones like Intifada, where one sees as negative, one sees as positive. But then let's think about one like peace, where I think both see it as positive, right? I think most people would like to have peace, would like to live in peace for their families and their communities. But even a term like this, which has positive connotations by all communities, still can have disagreements in terms of what it means or how people perceive it. So, as I talked about in a prior talk on peace processes, you can go more into this if you like, you can watch the recording. Just in a basic sense, there's multiple dimensions of peace. One is political peace, like what we see here on the top, and that's maybe what we classically think about, which is, negotiations and agreements between governments or between warring parties kind of have an end to armed conflict, right? And that's certainly important. And then maybe there's political recognition of states or otherwise. But then there's also interpersonal peace, right? To what extent do you as an individual feel like you have fear from oppression? You're free from feeling day to day like you or your family is going to be in danger? Do you have good relationships with people around you, particularly those from other national or ethnic communities? I mean, this is really important. This is what many people in political science call human security. So that's also important, right? And when we think about how these kind of dimensions combine in political science, we often do these 2x2 charts. We can see a lot of different outcomes. So one end, something like that's a warm peace would be, hey, you both have a political peace and an interpersonal peace. So that might be something like France and Germany, who again fought a number of wars in the 19th and 20th centuries that were, killed millions of people. But today, the French-German border is, pretty safe and easy to kind of move across, especially if you have citizenship in either state or EU citizenship. It's something where the idea of the French and German armies clashing together seems unfathomable now. The French and Germans certainly don't agree on everything from monetary policy to other issues, but in general, it's a pretty warm peace between those countries, which if you go back to 1817 or 1914 or 1941 or otherwise, like it seems pretty fantastical and amazing that you have these two countries that have fought multiple world wars against each other and kind of been the core of those fronts now have quite a warm peace. Other end of the spectrum, in many ways, is what the Israelis and Palestinians are experiencing right now, which is not a political peace between the two sides, and certainly not an interpersonal peace. Again, even before October 7th, you saw outbreaks of violence in mixed Palestinian and Israeli communities inside of Israel in some prior eras, as well as, violence between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank and previously in Gaza. And now certainly, almost full-blown conflict with the attack on October 7th by Hamas and Israeli attacks inside of Gaza and elsewhere since. So, that's kind of the opposite. We have neither interpersonal nor political peace. And there's kind of these grayer areas, right? So we talked about this one in a prior discussion, but the cold peace that Israel and Egypt has, where yes, there's political peace, and that's certainly not meaningless because these countries fought wars against each other in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. But since they signed a peace treaty in 78, 79, there have been no wars between Israel and Egypt. And that's a big positive, I think, in stability for the region, for the peoples in each of those countries. But there hasn't been strong interpersonal peace. There's not a lot of academic exchange or travel, minus, some Israelis going to a couple of Red Sea resorts. Like there's just not a lot of that. There's not a great deal of trade. And a lot of it stems from the fact that there's still a lot of animosity. For many Egyptians, they either feel strong solidarity with the Palestinians or anger at Israel for other issues. Vice versa with Israelis. Many Israelis don't look at Egyptians in a positive or trustworthy light. And you can find polls on this. So that's kind of a cold piece. On the other end, and I think this is kind of more of an empty set of sorts, there aren't a lot of these examples, but you can at least theoretically have a situation where there's interpersonal peace, but not political peace. So I call this like a warring brothers scenario, where maybe it's like, oh, the people get along, but for whatever reason, the governments have, taken them to war. Um, One thing that I think you can think about this in the context of Israel-Palestinian relations is something that the Netanyahu administration previously pushed called an economic peace, where basically he was saying both kind of implicitly and explicitly to Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank, we're not going to support your statehood or your independence, but we can try to support, greater economic opportunities and employment and like better day-to-day lives for you. Now, to be clear, many Palestinians, I would say probably the majority of Palestinians, rejected this and was like, this is a fig leaf to, give us some monetary handouts or otherwise, but simultaneously close the door on our political freedoms or our advocacy for Palestinians or for a Palestinian state. So again, this is maybe one of the reasons that you don't see many of these examples, but it is important to note that it is theoretically viable or possible at least. And again, it's not fully divorced from some of the policies that the current Israeli administration has pushed at various points regarding the West Bank. Now, to sum up, I see conversations going off track all the time related to some of the words that I talked about today, as well as just more charged words in the Israeli-Palestinian context, where it's like, okay, someone uses a word, the conversation goes off the rails, or people are subtly disagreeing. But even though it seems like they're disagreeing about the facts of the situation, they're angry about the terminology that was used or the biases behind it, or people are simultaneously fighting over what to talk about, but also how to talk about it. So I gave you some understanding today of different perceptions of these terms, but I want to do better than that. I want to give you some strategies for how can you still use or talk about these terms, but do so in a constructive way. So to me, there's kind of three steps that you can follow, and you don't have to follow these in exact order. You could switch one and two, but I have found these to be effective in my own conversations with students, with family members, with academics, peers, and otherwise. So the first step is, can you study and discuss the history of the word without the present context? If we're talking about terrorism or occupation, and we're talking about it in the context of the West Bank and Gaza, or October 7th, or whatever else, it's tough for us to pull those things apart. And so how we emotionally react to the term and how we apply it is so dominated by the present case that it's tough for us to actually really think about how we would define that term or how we would apply it. So can you study or can you talk with someone about, hey, like separate from this context, let's just talk about how we define this term, maybe how it's applied in other times or other places. Like that can be helpful. Secondly, you can do the total reverse of that and say, you know what, maybe what I or we care about is talking about the facts on the ground and the situation. And if some of these words are becoming an obstacle to that because we disagree what they mean, about what they mean, or when one of us uses it, the other one is triggered or really, angry about that. Let's just talk about the facts. So instead, can you just substitute your definition for the word itself? So if you think terrorism is the use or threat of violence by a non-state actor against a civilian target to achieve fear in an audience beyond the target for a political end, just say that. It's a little more wonky, but you could say, oh, this is an example where this non-state actor attacked civilians to try to achieve this political goal, and they were trying to inspire fear. Like, just use those words, because those are not going to be as objectionable, and they're going to force the person that you're talking to engage with the facts of what you're saying, as opposed to getting off into side conversations about the definition of the word or getting angry about that term. Like, people are going to be less angry about you saying, like, violence against civilians. Like, that's a bad thing. That's going to make people upset, I think. But not too many people are going to say, oh, violence or civilian. Like, obviously, yes, there are legal definitions for what civilian means, etc., but it's not triggering usually in the same way. So have a conversation about what matters to you about the present context, but maybe don't use the word. You again substitute your own definition or otherwise for it and see how that conversation goes. If you've done both of those things with someone, and it's like now we both have either a mutual agreement or at least a better mutual understanding of how we define these terms separately from the current context, and we can discuss the present context without those terms, then maybe can kind of combine it all together, and now we can talk about it. And now at least I understand what you mean when you say that term or that phrase, but I can still stay focused on the context and how I define it differently. So, this is the way it can go. And again, I've done all of these things in my classes, like my class on terrorism and political violence, or my class on Middle East politics, like we will talk about some of these words and then say, like, send me your definition. Let's look at different people's definitions. Let's look at different academic definitions. Let's talk about where the term terrorism comes from the French Revolution, but then it's used by anarchists, but then it's used sometimes to apply to Hitler and Stalin and purges and the Holocaust, but then it's used to apply to non-state actors, sometimes in national liberation movements. So again, that can be a great first step. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees at the end of the day how it should be defined. But when you have that historical background and context, I think it makes you more conscientious and probably more certain as well about how you define it, but also the diversity of opinions that people can have. I've also done the second thing, which is to say, hey, I want to get my point across. And so I'm not going to use a word that I know is going to create confusion or disagreement. So actually, in my first book, the core of it is about Israelis and Palestinians. So I spent years interviewing Israelis, interviewing Palestinians, living in both communities, working in archives. You can look at my first book. I don't use the word terrorism pretty much at all. If I use it at all, I'd have to go back and check. It's only because someone else is saying it in a quote that I think is important, but I'm not using the term. And it's not because I don't think any of the actions that are committed by one side or the other would not qualify under my academic definition of terrorism. But I made a choice in those moments to say, I'm trying to get across what each side did, the use of violence or nonviolence to try to achieve statehood, and why they were more or less successful at getting statehood in various periods. And I want the focus to be on that, not about the terminology I'm using or the disagreement or the implied bias or otherwise. So I don't feel like I was able to express myself any less well. In fact, in some ways, I think I was probably more exact about describing what happened. And again, check out my first book if you want to see. But that was a choice that I made there because, again, I wanted it to be about the content and the issues as opposed to, word selection, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I very commonly do number three, right? In my classes now, like we do number three, like we use these words, we use terrorism, we use occupation, we use genocide. Like it doesn't mean like we use them flippantly. These are very weighted, heavy, important terms. But if people want to use these terms, they can do so in my classes. And they understand that if they're using it in a paper, I want them to give a clear definition for it. Because if you're doing, academic scholarship, one of the key things is also you want to have cumulation. So you want to understand that if I'm using the term terrorism, using the term terrorism, I'm using occupation, you're occupation. If it seems like we have a disagreement about what we're saying, it could be because we're defining things differently. So you want to be clear about your definition. And you also want to be cognizant of the fact that other people can define differently and again have different reactions to things. So people make their own choices on the terminology they use. But when you've taken to varying degrees these prior steps, that step three, which is what many people dive into from the outset, that can become much more constructive and much better. Doesn't mean it's always going to work perfectly. And again, I've got other chapters in my book that talk about what you can do when things go wrong, or nonetheless, there are clashes and disagreements, whether from these terms or otherwise. But for today, I think this is a good start. So to close, again, I will be doing another talk in mid-November, November 13th, all about kind of broader regional relations. So if you're interested in Israeli and Palestinian relations with the Saudis, with Iran, with Syria, with Egypt. That's what the focus is going to be, as well as U.S. foreign policy in the region, because whatever happens in the week before that election, the U.S. election, which is, may not be decided by November 13th, but hopefully it is, there will be some potential changes whether it's President Harris or President Trump in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the region. So we'll talk a bit about that, focusing on regional relations between Israeli and Arab and Persian, Iranian actors. So come attend if you can. If you can't, again, there'll be a recording available for that as well. So with that, it's great to have you. I'm honored that you took the time to watch this. I hope you found it helpful. I hope it will help you in your own conversations, both understanding the conflict and Palestinians and Israelis more deeply, as well as your ability to have constructive and effective conversations with people around you. As always, if you like, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or drop me a line or check out my website if you want to see my publications or upcoming talks. All in all, though, have a great day and look forward to hopefully seeing you virtually or in person soon.